Hello and welcome back to Between the Hashes, our weekly college football primer. And today we are covering Rivalry Week. This is the episode I have been waiting to do all year. If you know my last name and you know who I'm related to, you knew exactly where I was going to go with this video. Ohio State versus Michigan, the game. And frankly, this is the highest stakes game this week. It's the highest stakes game this month, and it's the highest stakes game this season. And so far, at least. This is the first time this game is being played in Columbus in 4 years. As a quick reminder, the 2020 game was canceled due to a COVID outbreak on Michigan's side. And as a result, last year was the first time since 2019 that the game had been played. And that game was in Ann Arbor. And so there's an entire class of Ohio State players right now that have never played the game in Columbus, and that changes on Saturday. So what's really at stake here? So what's really at stake here beyond the fact that this is one of the biggest rivalries in the sport? Both teams are 11-0. Winner of this game goes to the Big Ten Championship game and likely plays against Iowa, but the Big Ten West is such a mess that who knows who comes out of that division. And likely ends up winning the conference regardless of who wins this game. The loser sits at 11-1 and still has a decent shot at the playoffs, but likely will need some help from like a Notre Dame or North Carolina, Southgate, somebody like that. While they still, in my opinion, should probably make the playoff over like a two-loss team, like a two-loss LSU team that has a 4-touchdown loss on its resume. Not everybody necessarily sees it that way, and so they're definitely going to need some help. This game could also decide who wins the Heisman. You have, with CJ Stroud and Blake Corum both being in the game, potentially at least with Corum, we'll talk about him a little bit later. So it's very, very likely that even if whomever wins this game probably gets a spot in the playoff regardless of what happens next week in the Big Ten Championship game, even though I think it's very unlikely that whomever wins this game loses next week. This is essentially a quarterfinal for the playoffs. And so we have national implications, we have Heisman implications, we have conference implications, and we have implications in one of the biggest rivalries in the sport. Doesn't get much better than this, guys. I've talked about both Ohio State and Michigan a couple of times this year, more Ohio State than Michigan, but with Michigan, we have one of the best defenses in the country and one of the best rushing offenses in the country. Now, Michigan is 4th in overall in rushing. Their offense is really built on having powerful offensive line play and really, really explosive running back play. So look at that Penn State game. That game really got blown wide open on a couple of really long, I think it was like 240 or 60 yards, something like that, touchdown runs, courtesy of Blake Corum. And the thing with Corum is he got hurt in the first half of the Illinois game last week, and so we don't know if he's even going to play in this game. Michigan has been very, very mum about his availability, and he's not the only running back in that room that's dealing with injuries. Both teams are kind of dealing with cluster injuries at that position, and I'll talk about Ohio State's issues in a minute, but it's going to be a little bit, in my opinion, it would be a little bit more devastating for Michigan to lose their running backs than it would be for Ohio State to lose their running backs. The thing with Michigan is that they've been so run dependent and so dependent on Corum that what do they do when he's not there? Because when he wasn't there, they had to come back at home against a good but not great Illinois team, and they had to win on a late field goal. The other thing about Michigan's offense is that, like last year, this year started out with them kind of having a tag team duo at quarterback, switching off between Cade McNamara and JJ McCarthy. Cade McNamara is more, I hate describing things like stereotypically, but Cade McNamara is more of just a traditional pocket, like a traditional like 90s, 2000s, 80s pocket passer, and JJ McCarthy has a little bit more. JJ McCarthy's a little bit more of a dynamic athlete with his legs. A couple games into the season, Harbaugh announced that McCarthy was going to get the start, and he hasn't given up his job since. Having said that, they are 99th in overall passing, and that is probably the most concerning thing for me if I'm a Michigan fan, because you're definitely going to need better numbers than that to hang with this Ohio State team, in my opinion. Not that he isn't capable of doing it, it's just that we haven't seen it. Mainly because Michigan just hasn't asked McCarthy, or McNamara for that matter, to be that guy. So what happens when they're in a position where they have to play like that? We got a little bit of a preview with that last week. So once again, what happens with Michigan when they are forced to get outside of their comfort zone on offense? I don't know. And especially, let alone in a hostile environment, because last week's game, they had the benefit of playing at home. They will not get that here. Defensively, Michigan is first in overall defense, and they are second in yards per play given up, only second to, once again, our friends, the Iowa Hawkeyes. And so their defense has been stepping up. They lost a lot of production to the draft and just to graduation last year, most notably Aiden Hutchinson, but he's not alone there. That said, their pass rushing numbers have been fairly consistent with what last year's were. It's just not all coming from one guy. And so they have a pretty deep and pretty talented defensive front. And so, if anything, that unit is probably going to be what keeps Michigan in the game. And if they win, that unit is probably why they win. Now, for the Ohio State side, their offensive numbers really haven't changed all that much since I last talked about them. They're still they're averaging 7.39 yards per play. They're second in the country in points per game at 46.5 points per game. They're ninth in overall defense, giving up 4.54 yards per play. Statistically, they've been fairly consistent pretty much all year. Ohio State, like Michigan, is also dealing with injuries. And Ohio State is dealing with a cluster of injuries at the running back position. They lost backup running back Evan Pryor to injuries. Their projected two-starter 1-2 punch at backs, Mayan Williams and Travion Henderson, had both kind of alternated who's hurt at what time. An ankle here, a hamstring there, a twisted knee there. None of it has been season-ending for the most part. But it's been enough, and it's been consistent and nagging the whole time. And it's like even guys farther down the depth chart than that have been dealing with like hammies and things like that. And that's not even talking about their wide receiver room, but it's with Jackson Smith-Njigba, who's still probably like the most talented receiver in the country. He has something like 5 catches on the year. He hurt his hamstring in the very first game right before Labor Day against Notre Dame, and he's tried to come back a couple of times since then, but it's just each time it just seems like he's re-aggravated that leg, and so Ohio State's been very, very, very cautious as far as he's concerned. Now, the thing for Ohio State that is a little bit more encouraging about their injury situation than Michigan's injury situation is that Ohio State has shown the ability to have the depth to overcome those injuries. And I'm not saying Michigan doesn't have that depth. I'm just saying they haven't been in a position where they've needed to show it until now. And so, for example, one of the heroes of the game against Maryland for Ohio State was true freshman running back Dallin Hayden, someone who was way down the depth chart at the beginning of the year. He rushed for 146 yards on 27 carries and 3 touchdowns. And so what I'm getting at is that when Ohio State has needed people to step up, they have been available to. With JSN out, Marvin Harrison has blossomed into one of the best receivers in the country. And then Julian Fleming was also dealing with injury issues, although he's been back. Ibuka has been a very, very good receiver for them, even though he had kind of a quiet last couple of weeks. And so Ohio State has been able to overcome their injuries up to this point. And a lot of that is also CJ Stroud has just been playing at a very, very high level. He's going to go to New York in a couple of weeks, and he's still the odds-on favorite to win the Heisman. And my guess is that if Ohio State wins this game, he probably does win the Heisman. So, who is going to win this game? Michigan has not won in Columbus in over 2 decades. I've said this before, it's unbelievably difficult to win on the road, let alone in a game of this magnitude. And Ohio State hasn't beaten Michigan since 2019, even though the 2020 game was nobody's fault as it wasn't played. And so there's going to be a revenge and motivation factor. That's not to say that that game matters any less to Michigan. Believe me, it doesn't. The main reason why I think Ohio State wins is that, again, it's really the injuries. Even if Blake Corum were healthy, I'd probably still lean Ohio State, but with Michigan's running back room kind of up in the air in terms of health, the biggest question for me becomes, what can their quarterbacks do? I don't know that their quarterbacks are capable hanging with what CJ Stroud is capable of doing. And so Ohio State can kind of just blitz you, and then next thing you know, you're down 3 scores after about 3 or 4 minutes in game time. Michigan capable of withstanding that kind of run, and are they capable of answering the bell without one of their best players and without one of the best players in the country? I don't know, and I have a hard time seeing it, especially on the road. And one of the biggest factors in the game last year was the fact that that Michigan's defensive and offensive fronts controlled and dictated that game. Michigan did whatever it wanted on the ground and whatever it wanted in the pass rush. I don't know that they're going to be able to do the same this year, especially on the offensive side. Ohio State's defense has been drastically improved, and Ohio State's weak point as a defense does not match up with Michigan's strength as an offense. And that is the thing that concerns me if I'm a Michigan fan. Only once this year have Ohio State given up more than 4 yards per carry, and that was against Wisconsin. And a lot of those carries came in after Wisconsin was already down by about 50 points. So they're not going to be able to take advantage of Ohio State's defense the way that they did last year. So without that, and with Corum up in the air, even if he does play, what's he going to look like? Are they even going to be able to use him all that much, or is he going to be on a pitch count? Line is about 7.5, out of respect for Michigan and what they've done this year. If Michigan were anybody else, I'd say Ohio State wins this game comfortably. Because this is a rivalry game, because it's a game of this magnitude, I'm going to hedge it and play it a little safe here. Ohio State wins, but Michigan covers. Okay, lightning round. There's other interesting rivalry games this week, and I want to talk to you about them. Let's go to the Pacific Northwest in the game formerly known as the Civil War, with Oregon versus Oregon State. The game is at Oregon State. I think I trust Oregon a little bit more in this game, so I'm going to lean with them. Staying out west, we have the Apple Cup with Washington against Washington State. Once again, the higher-ranked and favored team is on the road. Washington has had a really nice season, and they're still alive in making a bid for the Pac-12 title game. I don't think they're going to let that opportunity slip. I think Washington wins in a close game. Tennessee, Vanderbilt. A lot of people see this as a huge potential upset because of Hendon Hooker's injury and the fact that where is Tennessee's heads going to be at, given that their entire season has completely been destroyed after that South Carolina loss. And Vanderbilt is coming off a 2-game win streak and is fighting for bowl eligibility. And the game is in Nashville, so the line's 14, but I really do think Vanderbilt has more of an edge than people realize. But I kind of think Vanderbilt actually wins. Kansas at Kansas State. Game's in Manhattan. I just have a hard time seeing Kansas State lose this game. For as nice of a story Kansas is this year, they'll get their bowl game, and I think they'll have a chance to have a winning record, but that won't come until a few more weeks. So Kansas State wins in Farmageddon. Which brings us to... So I wanted to talk about USC Notre Dame in a little bit more depth than I would have in the lightning round, because I think this game is very fascinating. Obviously, it's not underrated. It's not an underrated game, but it is the next most consequential game happening this week. So Notre Dame, after starting out 0-2 with a loss to Ohio State and then a really bad loss to Marshall and then losing their starting quarterback for the season, they went 8-1 over that next stretch. That was interspersed with a pretty bad loss to Stanford, which isn't really defensible. But it's safe to say that Marcus Freeman has turned things around. They beat the hell out of Clemson, and then they beat North Carolina. So by transitive property, they've won the ACC. Can they do the same thing with the Pac-12? Caleb Williams has played himself firmly into the Heisman conversation, and some people are saying he should win it after the UCLA game. You can make a very, very good case for Caleb Williams winning the award. And USC played an epic and thrilling game against UCLA last week. And I said USC's defense, while being terrible, the one strength that they have is turnovers. They picked off DTR 3 times in that game, including to seal the game at the very end. For Notre Dame to win this game is to control the game on the ground. They have one of the best defenses in the country, and by far the best defense USC will have played. Now, the question is, if USC gets a couple hot plays off, can Notre Dame answer? I don't think so. This is one of those games where I think Notre Dame can win, but I also think that the strengths Notre Dame has as a team, which is mainly its offensive and defensive line play, I don't know that they're going to be able to take advantage of USC's defense, because USC, while having a very, 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 very low-ranked defense, a lot of that is attributed to their abysmal pass defense, and I just don't think Notre Dame is capable of taking advantage of it the way that, like, say, UCLA or Utah did. I don't think USC is one of the 4 best teams in the country this year, mainly because of that defense. They'll probably get into the playoff, but I just have a hard time seeing USC overcome its defensive weaknesses this year, but I don't think this is the game where that is going to come back to haunt them. So I think USC wins in a game that's much closer than people think. Well, that's all the time I have for you guys today. Thanks for watching. Remember to give us a like, a comment, subscribe, all that stuff. It's YouTube. You know the drill. Remember to tune in every week for the John Keim Report for more updates on the Washington Commanders. Remember to tune in to All's Caps for updates on the Washington Capitals as Ovi gets closer and closer to that record. Remember to subscribe to Empire Media on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Remember, that's Empire, A-M-P-I-R-E. It's Empire with an A. Thanks, guys. Enjoy the games, and go Bucks.